The United Nations says 400,000 people in Syria are trapped in areas besieged by either the government, rebels or other armed groups. This week, aid finally reached the town of Madaya, where residents had been literally starving to death. Joining me now to discuss this from New York is Sarah Leah Whitson, Executive Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division for Human Rights Watch. Sarah, thanks for joining me on UpFront. We're hearing reports of residents in Madaya having been forced to eat the city's stray cats and dogs. Such has been the level of starvation brought about by a brutal 6-month-long siege. UN investigators are now debating whether it's a war crime or even a crime against humanity. What's your view on that issue? And is the Assad regime and its allies 100% responsible for it?
Well, the Assad regime is 100% responsible for the siege in Madaya and a number of other places that it has barred from allowing aid in and people to leave out. Of course, these are not the only besieged areas in Syria. Islamic State is holding people hostage. Other armed groups have besieged areas and are similarly depriving the civilian population of aid.
There are 2 towns, aren't there, that are also controlled nearby by government loyalists that have been besieged by rebel groups. What's the situation on the ground in those towns like?
The reports we're hearing are quite similar. There's absence and lack of medical supplies, very limited food supplies, very limited electricity, and even water in some areas is hard to access. It's incredibly disappointing and distressing, not only because of the broken commitments to allowing aid into besieged areas, not only because it violates international humanitarian law, but also because it's a show of extreme bad faith in the lead up to what is supposed to be a peace process. This does not bode well.
You mentioned the peace talks, this not boding well for peace talks, the latest atrocities. Do you think there is an alternative that the international community hasn't yet explored, which could bring this conflict, if not to a close, then at least do something about these vicious war crimes that we're seeing on the ground?
Well, I think the peace process right now in the current circumstances is probably the best option in terms of what everyone seems to be focused on. What absolutely has to stop is the killing of civilians and the destruction of all of Syria's infrastructure. And I think some kind of a peace process is the only way to achieve that. It's extremely disturbing that the momentum has been knocked off its very fragile position with the recent skirmishes between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And yet again, it is the Syrian people who are going to pay the price for these regional power dynamics.
You mentioned regional power dynamics in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Earlier on in the show, I was speaking to a prominent Saudi commentator and a former Iranian official who were both attacking each other's human rights abuses. I just want to get your take as a long-standing observer and expert on the region. Let me just start with Saudi Arabia. Do you accept the Saudi argument that beheaded Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr wasn't a political prisoner, but was rather a violent dissident calling for regime change in Riyadh, and that's why they executed him alongside members of al-Qaeda? That's what they say.
Well, there's certainly nothing in the evidentiary record to suggest that the Saudi argument is correct. Everything we know about Sheikh Nimr, even the charges against him were not of the sort to allege that he actually carried out violent attacks. I think the only violence-related charge against him was resisting arrest or some such allegation. But he was also clearly charged with crimes having to do with his political opinions and his political statements. Sheikh Nimr had himself disavowed violence and made very clear that he thought the best way to achieve an end to the discrimination against the Shia community in Saudi Arabia was through peaceful advocacy.
So why, in your view, do you think the Saudi authorities executed a person you're basically describing as a political prisoner?
Well, I think that's a question that's better directed for the Saudi Arabians. Clearly, it was a disastrous move on their part, since it will neither quell the appropriate and legitimate demands of the Shia population in Saudi Arabia for an end to the discrimination against it, nor does it help the region in the extent to which it has stoked tensions with Iran at a very delicate and fragile time when all hands are needed on deck to deal with the problem in Syria. So it was a really unwise move, both domestically, regionally, and globally.
And when you hear Iranians condemning Saudi executions as a violation of international law and human rights, what's your response to them?
It would be laughable if it wasn't so sad and cynical, given the fact that Iran's death penalty and execution rate is by far the worst in the entire region, and the arbitrary arrests and executions in Iran is rightly disturbing in its own regard. We have documented dozens and dozens of cases of prisoners sentenced to death in Iran without any modicum of a fair trial, and of course the very numbers of people executed, the vast majority of whom we believe to be drug offenders, are not crimes for which people should have been executed or sentenced to death in the first place.
Out of interest, and you're the expert here, of these two countries, which do you think has the worst human rights record?
Well, we don't even rank, we don't really rank countries vis-a-vis each other. I think I can fairly say that they're very much neck and neck in close competition, but the extent to which they disrespect and disregard the rights and freedoms of their own citizens. Obviously, Iran has some elements of democratic government. There is at least a process in which the international community doesn't necessarily know who the winner is going to be in the Iranian electoral process, but there is no form of democratic representation other than weak, toothless municipal councils that have sporadic elections in Saudi Arabia.
Sarah Leah Whitson, thanks so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.